If there's one name etched in the Mount Rushmore of guitar gods, it's Eric Clapton. From the Yardbirds to Cream, his fingers didn't just strum, they screamed with soul, reshaped British rock, and left even fellow legends chasing his shadow. But for all the stadium roars and platinum records, Clapton's story isn't just about glory. Behind the solos, lies silence. Behind the legacy, a deep, festering resentment. Because for all his fame, there's one person Clapton has never forgiven. A figure who didn't just break his heart, they cracked his very soul. He hasn't spoken much about it. Until now. This isn't just a story of rock and roll. It's a story of betrayal, obsession, and a love that spiraled into hate. Who is the person Clapton still can't let go of, and why does her name still burn after all these years? Let's go back, to the beginning of the man behind the guitar, and the scars behind the legend. Eric Clapton's life didn't begin with applause, it began with a lie. Born in the quiet village of Ripley, Surrey, his entry into the world was marked by secrecy and abandonment. His mother, Patricia Molly Clapton, was only 16. His father, Edward Walter Fryer, a 25-year-old Canadian soldier, vanished before Eric ever opened his eyes, shipped back to Canada, never to return, never to meet the son he fathered. With no father and a mother too young to raise him, Eric was passed into the arms of his grandparents, Rose and Jack Clapton. But the truth didn't follow him there. Instead, a fabricated family tree was planted, one where Rose and Jack were his parents, and Patricia was just a much older sister. Even his name, Clapton, came not from his real father, but from Patricia's first husband. It was a borrowed name, masking a fractured identity. When Patricia remarried and left England for Germany, she didn't just leave behind her past, she left behind her son. Eric remained in Surrey, a boy with talent in his hands and questions in his heart, shaped by a childhood of confusion and quiet pain. He grew up with the only parents he knew. It wasn't the most normal start to his life, but it shaped him, and somewhere in that quiet, tangled youth, a spark was lit. Eric got a cheap acoustic Hoyer guitar made in Germany for his 13th birthday. It wasn't love at first strum, the steel strings hurt his fingers, and the sound wasn't easy to get. He gave up on it for a while, but 2 years later he picked it up again, and this time he didn't let go. He started practicing obsessively, drawn to the soul of the blues. He'd spend hours listening to old records, learning each note by ear, and playing along until the music felt like it belonged to him. He even recorded his practice sessions on a Grundig Realtor tape recorder and played them over and over until they felt like they were his. At age 16, Clapton's talent was already getting noticed. He dropped out of Hollyfield School in Surbiton and went to Kingston College of Art, but his heart was never in painting. Before the school year ended, he was kicked out for spending too much time with his guitar instead of painting. What seemed like a setback was actually the start of something great. He started busking around Kingston, Richmond, and London's West End, playing the blues for anyone who would listen. In 1962, he joined forces with Dave Brock, another blues fan, and Clapton played in pubs across Sydney. A year later, when Clapton was only 17, he joined his first real band, the Roosters, a British R&B group where he played with guitarist Tom McGuinness. He stayed with them until August 1963 and then joined Casey Jones and the Engineers for a short 7-gig run. These were the first steps of a legend in the making. Clapton was still a teenager, but his journey had begun, and soon the world would know his name not only as a guitarist but also as a singer. In the early days, before the money and the mansions, Eric Clapton was just another young man hauling bricks and swinging hammers at construction sites to make ends meet. Music was his passion, but it wasn't yet his paycheck. Word of Clapton's talent was already spreading quickly through London's West End pub circuit, where he was already being talked about as one of the best guitarists around, even though there weren't many fans and no paychecks. That was in October 1963. Clapton's life changed when he got the call to join the Yardbirds, a rising rhythm and blues band looking for a lead guitarist. It was with the Yardbirds that Clapton had his first commercial success, with songs like Good Morning Little Schoolgirl, and For Your Love going up the charts and giving him a foothold in the business. But Clapton wasn't happy with the band, they were becoming too pop for him, and he didn't want to water it down. So, in 1965, just as the band was breaking out. In a strange twist, the guitarists who replaced Clapton, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, would also go on to become rock icons. But Clapton wasn't looking back. Later that same year, he joined John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, a band that let him get back to his blues roots. In 1966, they released the Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton, a record that didn't just show off his playing, it immortalized it. Songs like What Did I Say and Rambling on My Mind proved to diehard fans what they already knew: Clapton wasn't just a great guitarist. It was something else entirely. Clapton's solos on the album were so electrifying and soul-stirring that people in London started writing 3 words in spray paint on city walls and tube stations: Clapton is God. It wasn't just hype, it was gospel for a generation discovering how far the blues could go. But even being a god wasn't enough to keep him in one place for long. Soon after the album came out, Clapton left the Blues Breakers and formed a new power trio called Cream. Along with Ginger Baker on drums and Jack Bruce on bass, Cream wasn't just. Clapton took traditional blues songs like Crossroads and Spontacular and turned them into fiery, extended jams. He also pushed into new territory with psychedelic hits like Sunshine of Your Love and White Room. Over the next few years, they released 3 critically acclaimed albums: Fresh Cream, Israeli Gears, and Wheels of Fire. They also went on a lot of tours, especially in the US, where fans were looking for raw and wild music, and Electric Cream had it all: the chops, the chemistry, and the energy to play. Clashing egos, especially between Bruce and Baker, turned rehearsals into war zones after 2 final concerts at London's Royal Albert Hall. Cream broke up in 1968, ending another chapter. Clapton wasn't done yet, though. He formed Blind Faith almost right away, teaming up with Ginger Baker again and adding Steve Winwood and Rick Gretsch. Despite all the hype, Blind Faith didn't last long. 1 album and a disastrous US tour later, they were also done. Eric Clapton was a genius on the guitar, but stability was a whole other story. His lack of stability showed in his love life, which was very unstable. Eric Clapton is not only one of the most famous guitarists in history, he's also one of the most talked about figures in rock, both for the music he made and for the life he lived outside of the studio. From the moment he came on the scene in the 1960s, the English rocker lived in a spotlight that never really went away. Eric's complicated love life got almost as much attention as his guitar riffs and lyrics. It all started when he met Alice Ormsby Gore, the daughter of the 5th Baron of Harrell and a young Eric. She was still in her late teens and he was in his early 20s. The two quickly fell into an on-and-off relationship that was tumultuous and played out against the background of fame, drugs, and Eric's growing obsession with another woman, George Harrison's friend and songwriting partner. They were both high on heroin while they were dating, and even though there were rumors of an engagement, it was never confirmed. In 1974, Eric ended their relationship for good because he decided to pursue the woman he had been crushing on for years, Patty. Even though Eric and Patty went their separate ways, Alice stayed close to his family and died of a heroin overdose at the age of 42. Then there was Patty Boyd, the woman who would become the center of one. In one of rock's most famous love triangles, Patty Harrison was married to George Harrison of the Beatles when Eric Clapton fell hard for her, even though they had a close musical connection. The tension built up until the late 1970s, when everything came to a head. After a string of affairs on both sides, Patty and George finally got a divorce in 1977, and just 2 years later, in 1979, she married Eric. On paper, it looked like a fairy tale, with rock royalty finally getting together. Behind closed doors, the marriage had problems from the start. Both Eric and Patty struggled with alcoholism, and even more upsetting, Patty later said that Clapton had sexually abused her while they were together. Eric's affairs only made things worse. He had many affairs during their marriage, and they also had fertility problems, including failed IVF treatments and several miscarriages in 1987. After years of heartbreak and betrayal, Patti finally left, and their divorce was finalized in 1989. In 1991, Eric fell in love again with property developer Rod Weston, and after years of dating, they got married in 2015. Of the many affairs that destroyed Eric and Patti's marriage, two stood out because of the children they gave him. In 1984, Clapton started dating Yvonne Kelly, who was the manager of Error Studios' Mansoura. Both of them were married at the time, but their affair led to the birth of a daughter Ruth in 1985. Eric's paternity was kept secret for years until 1991, when Ruth's existence was finally made public. But it was another affair that really tore apart his personal life. Long after Ruth was born, Clapton started dating Italian actress and model Lori Delanto. They had a son named Connor in 1986, and for a short time Eric felt like he had a new purpose as a father. But in 1991, tragedy struck. Connor died in a heartbreaking accident when he fell from the 53rd floor window of a New York apartment building. He was only 4 years old. Eric's grief was unbearable, and Patti's decision to end their already broken relationship was sparked by Connor's death. Years later, at a party in Columbus, Ohio, in 1998, Eric Clapton, then 53, met Melia McInnery, then 22, who worked as an administrative assistant. What started as a quiet romance quickly turned into something serious. The couple kept their relationship private for the first year, but in 1999 they went public with their relationship. In 2002, they got married in a low-key ceremony in Suriname. Unlike his previous relationships, Clapton has often said that Melia is the first woman he's been truly faithful to. With her, he found stability that he had been looking for decades. Together, they've built a family. Julie was born in 2001, Ella in 2003, and Sophie in 2005. All three girls are now grown and live between the UK and the US. They are close with their parents and their half-sister Ruth, making a blended family that finally feels whole after years of chaos and loss. A bitter love triangle is often called one of the most mythical romantic entanglements in rock and roll history. Three musicians will always be remembered for their roles in a famous love triangle: George Harrison, Patti Boyd, and Eric Clapton. The words to one of the Beatles' most beautiful love songs, Something in the Way She Moves, were more than just poetry, they were personal. George Harrison wrote Something for his then-wife Patti Boyd, a beautiful model and photographer whose presence seemed to attract rock royalty. But George wasn't the only one who saw magic in the way she moved. His best friend and frequent collaborator Eric Clapton fell under the same spell. Eric's love for Patti would lead to his 1970s masterpiece, Layla, a raw, heartbreaking cry of longing performed with his blues rock band Derek and the Dominoes. At the time, George and Patti were still married, and while they seemed solid on the outside, cracks were beginning to show in their marriage, creating a strange love triangle that would change the music and lives of all those involved. Patti Boyd met George Harrison in 1964 when she was cast as a schoolgirl in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first movie. George fell in love with her the moment he saw her and asked her to go on a date that same day. She politely declined because she was seeing photographer Eric Swain at the time, but she was thrilled inside. In a diary entry found decades later, in 2022, she wrote, "George Harrison asked me out." The excitement didn't fade when she was invited to the film's premiere. She made sure she was single in case George asked again, and this time she said yes. They started dating soon after and got married on January 21, 1966. Paul McCartney was always a loyal bandmate. That same year, Eric Clapton was still riding the high of his early fame with the Yardbirds. He and George met in late 1964 and quickly became friends based on their love of the guitar. Their friendship would last even as their bands broke up and their solo careers took off. Clapton would go on to play lead guitar on Harrison's haunting track, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, marking a historic collaboration between two of rock's greats. But it wasn't just music they shared. Spending time at George's house made Eric more and more interested in Patti. He dated her sister Paula Boyd for a short time to try to distract himself from his feelings, but it didn't work. His obsession only grew stronger, and it drove him crazy to the point where he turned to legend for comfort, drawing from the 7th century story of Layla and Majnun, a story of madness caused by unrequited love. From that longing, Clapton wrote Layla, his plea for Patty to leave George and be with him, but she refused, saying her heart still belonged to her husband. Rejected and heartbroken, Clapton turned to heroin. He shut himself off from the world for years because of his problem. Behind closed doors, things weren't so great for Patty and George. George, who was known as the mystic Beatle, had taken up Eastern philosophies and meditation and even brought Patty along for the spiritual journey. But his inner peace didn't keep his demons at bay. Cocaine use, mood swings, and an increasingly unstable personality made their marriage difficult. Patty tried to hold on, but it was his cheating on her, most famously with Maureen Starkey Ringo Starr's wife Patty too strayed and engaged in an affair with. In 1974, she ended her relationship with George by saying that his affair with Ronnie Wood, then of Faces and later of the Rolling Stones, was ludicrous and hateful. In an interview with The Telegraph in 2022, she said, "It was an extremely difficult decision of mine to make. I felt that I had to leave George because things were getting really out of hand. George was just being a different George. We had gone in different directions basically, but we still loved each other." She went on to say, "I think he wanted to spread his wings and take advantage of being the handsome famous rich guy that he was." Their divorce was finalized on June 9, 1977. A few weeks later, Clapton came back into the picture. After years of searching, Eric finally had Patty. They started dating soon after her divorce and got married on March 27, 1979, in Tucson, Arizona. The marriage was the end of Clapton's search, but it wasn't the happy ending he may have imagined. Eric's alcoholism became a major problem again, and he often drank too much. Leading to violent behavior, Patty started drinking a lot and got caught in. There were some beautiful moments, like when Clapton wrote one of his most famous songs, Wonderful Tonight, about Patty getting ready for Paul and Linda McCartney's annual Buddy Holly party. But love songs weren't enough. Their repeated failed attempts to have children through IVF left deep emotional scars. Eric's cheating returned, including a famous affair with Italian actress Lori Delanto that led to the birth of his son Connor in 1986. That was the final blow. Patty left him, and they got a divorce in 1987. In comments many years later, she questioned Clapton's intentions, saying that Eric only wanted what George had after her second marriage. After her marriage ended, Patty had a problem of identity, which she later talked about. "Well, I'm not Mrs. Famous George or Mrs. Famous Eric anymore, so who am I? No one knows me, and I don't even know myself," she said. Even though a lot happened between them, George and Eric stayed friends. There were arguments, of course. One famous story says that Eric and George played guitar against each other at George's Friar Park home in an attempt to win Patty's love. Legendary actor John Hurt was reportedly there and said it was an electric atmosphere where no one dared to speak. Patty confirmed the incident, but Eric always denied it. Interestingly, Patty's relationships with both men never crossed paths, so there was a clean handoff. George even went to Eric and Patty's wedding and joked that he was their husband-in-law. When Patty told George she was dating Eric, his response was, "Well, I'm glad you're going off with Eric instead of some idiot." He supposedly told her that neither of Boyd's marriages would last, but she was already famous as one of rock and roll's most legendary muses, with songs like Something So Sad, Eric's Layla Wonderful Tonight, and Belleton Blues. There were a lot of problems in the relationship between these two men and one woman. Patty and George stayed close until he died. In her autobiography, My Life in Pictures, Boyd included a picture of the two of them in the early 1990s at Friar Park, the house they used to share. "Just because things didn't work out as planned, it didn't diminish our love for each other," she wrote. In the end, it seems there really was something in the way she moved, something that inspired, tormented and tethered three lives in a way that even time could never quite untangle. Eric Clapton's controversies. Clapton has long been praised for his musical genius, but behind the fame and wealth lies a story of drug and alcohol abuse and unimaginable personal loss. For the first time, Clapton has publicly admitted that he was violent toward his first wife, model and muse Pattie Boyd, when he was fully dependent on drugs and alcohol. In a raw confession to the Sunday Times, Clapton talked about how his alcoholism destroyed their marriage in the 1980s and admitted that he had forced Boyd to have sex with him. At the time, he thought it was his right, but now that he looks back, he says he didn't care about the people around him, and that those closest to him lived in constant fear of his mood swings. Clapton remembered that people would be careful around him because they didn't know if he'd come home from the pub in a good mood or break everything. Boyd, who famously left ex-Beatle George Harrison to marry Clapton in 1979, got into a relationship based on passion but saw it fall apart due to addiction and emotional instability. The marriage ended. In 1988, when Clapton was at the top of his career, he admitted that there was always darkness in the world. He said that most nights, even though he had fame, talent, and recognition, he still wanted to die. As the pressure to create increased due to public expectations, Clapton said he began to spiral deeper into addiction and began to question not only his career but also his very identity. If he needed alcohol to write music, he wondered if he wasn't meant to be a musician at all, so he quit for a while. What am I really? That painful soul-searching eventually led him to something better. These days, Clapton spends a lot of time at the Crossroads Center, a drug and alcohol rehab center he started in Antigua. He recently made headlines when he auctioned off 150 of his guitars, including some of his most beloved ones, to raise almost $5 million for the center. One of the guitars that sold was his beloved 1956 Fender Stratocaster Brownie, which is where he wrote Layla. It sold for an amazing $497,500. Clapton told the Sunday Times that he was willing to give up everything for the cause, even if it meant going down in flames. Clapton first moved to Antigua in 1991 to get away and heal after the death of his 4-year-old son Connor. Connor's death made Clapton think about himself. The lyrics to Tears in Heaven ask, "Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? Would it be the same?" showed how he felt about losing a child. When it came out in 1991, the ballad was an international hit, topping charts in over 20 countries and winning multiple Grammys, including Song of the Year and Best Male Pop Vocal Performance. But behind its soft melody lay the heartbreak that changed Clapton's life forever. On March 20, 1991, Connor Clapton, son of Eric Clapton and Italian actress Lori Delanto, fell to his death from a 53rd-floor Manhattan apartment where a cleaner had left a window open. Connor was only 4 years old at the time. Years old got too close. Clapton had been staying at a nearby hotel and was getting ready to take Connor to the Central Park Zoo with him as a father-son trip. Then there was the call, a sudden, sharp one. Del Santo became on the alternative stop screaming that their son changed into long past. In a 1992 interview with British journalist Sue Loy, Clapton remembered that second vividly. He were on the brink of leave the inn, he stated whilst he answered the phone and heard Lori screaming it become too much to understand and he shut down straight away. Nonetheless, in a daze he rushed to the rental, constructing simplest to be met by means of chaos, ambulances, fireplace vehicles and paramedics swarming the scene. Walking into the horror, Clapton said he felt completely detached, as although he had stepped into a person else's nightmare, he admitted it not felt like his lifestyles, and even years later he stated that feel of disconnection hadn't long passed away. Connor's funeral held simply 2 days before Clapton's 46th birthday. The loss become unspeakable, it beaten him, and but in an extraordinary and bittersweet twist. It also have become the purpose he stayed sober. Clapton had already faced down many demons earlier than Connor's birth. He had kicked heroin in the late 70s, but alcohol and cocaine still gripped him tightly. While Connor arrived in 1986, Clapton knew something had to change. He could not be that man around his son. In his memoir Clapton, the autobiography, he wrote that he were given sober for Connor. He stated he could not bear the idea of his son developing up and forming an photograph of him primarily based at the model of himself that existed then, inspired by way of fatherhood. He Stayed sober for 3 years, and then came the twist of fate. By way of all logic it could have undone the whole thing, however instead it deepened his commitment. He withdrew into grief, splitting his time among Antigua and England, immersing himself in music and restoration meetings. From that season of mourning got here of his most private songs. One Become Circus left town, recounting the closing night time he spent with Connor at a circus. The opposite turned into Tears in Heaven, a track so intimate Clapton first of all in no way intended to release it, but he became endorsed to include it on the soundtrack for the 1991 film Rush. And later achieved it on MTV Unplugged in 1992, sharing his sorrow with the world. What started as personal mourning have become an international anthem. Tears in Heaven went directly to emerge as Clapton's great promoting U.S. single and an undying ballad of affection. Loss and letting cross Connor's demise left an unfillable void, but it additionally opened the door to reconnection. Clapton's daughter Ruth Kelly Clapton were born a year before Connor, the kid of Clapton and Yvonne Kelly, a studio supervisor from Montserrat. After the tragedy, Yvonne reached out and provided him the danger to construct a relationship with Ruth. Clapton embraced it. In his memoir he contemplated on how recovery it became simply to be round a baby again, his child, over time through shared moments and developing accept as true with he and Ruth cast a bond that have become critical to his recuperation. Looking again, Clapton stated Ruth were critical to his restoration. She gave him something actual to care about. He defined she gave him purpose in many ways he brought. She saved his life. Eric Clapton's tale is not just about track or repute, it's about reckoning, redemption, and the lengthy avenue to recuperation. At the back of the blues licks and iconic riffs is a man who stared down his demons, confronted the wreckage of his beyond, and determined to combat for extraordinary destiny. One notice someday, one quiet miracle at a time. What do you reflect on? Consideration on the love triangle between Eric Clapton, Pattie Boyd, and George Harrison. Do you watched Clapton in reality loved Boyd, or do you watched otherwise? Proportion your mind with us inside the comments under. Consider to love, share, and